Namaste and greetings. I am Mahima Kapoor, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली. Extend my warm welcome to you all to the IMPRI hashtag Web Policy Learning. We have gathered on the day 2 of the 3-day immersive online certificate training program on Feminism and the Global Social Transformation. This training program is being organized by the IMPRI Gender Impact Study Center. This course will strengthen feminist consciousness and solidarity and provide a basic understanding of feminist concepts and worldview along with opportunities to link with feminist campaigns. It will include sessions on understanding the intersectionalities of feminism and social justice and transformative change at a personal and societal level. It will also build an understanding of feminism, feminist movements, and link gender to other structures and systems in society within a global framework. In these 3 days, we have an eminent panel of experts who would be sharing their knowledge on the above theme. The course advisor is Professor Vibhuti Patel, visiting professor IMPRI New Delhi, and former professor, Advanced Center for Women's Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. The theme for day 2 is intersectional feminism, social justice, and transformative change at personal and societal levels. We welcome this team panel for today, which is as follows. Dr. Linda Lane, Senior Lecturer, Department of Social Work, University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Professor Indira Ramarao, Scholar in Residence, Center for Women's Studies, Bangalore University, Bengaluru, and former Professor of Sociology, University of Mysore. And Professor Pushpesh Kumar, Professor, Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad. Welcome. Please keep in mind the housekeeping rules mentioned in the course outline document. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box only and not in the chat box, posting it by your name and not as an anonymous attendee. Also keep the questions precise and refrain from making any general comments to save time and learn more. We have also shared the reading materials curated by the experts in the Google folder. With these initial remarks, I would like to welcome Professor Vibhuti Patel for her opening remarks.
Yeah. Friends, first of all, I thank IMPRI team for the hard work and also greet my co-panelists or those who have been in this course, Dr. Linda Lane, my Professor Indira Ramarao, Professor Pushpesh Kumar, Dr. Leena Pujari, and it has been really a pleasurable experience for 9 of us to work in unison. We are intellectually also on the same wavelength of sensibility and sensitivity. And yesterday's, the day 1, which was initiated by Dr. Leena Pujari, she highlighted the contribution of individual feminist foremothers right from the time of Greek civilization. She referred to epics and literary representations. Classics she went into. She also gave an overview of the feminist contributions in the early 70s by, as she started with Simone de Beauvoir and Kate Millett and Germaine Greer and Shulamit Firestone. And she also showed that how women have been hidden from the history, and it is her story always remains at the backstage. It just remains in the dustbin of history. And now the experiments are made and the efforts are made by women's studies scholars and feminist activists to unearth their contribution. And she also said that how women who were challenging the patriarchal norms and the patriarchal stereotypes had to pay a very heavy price. The whole history of witch hunting, calling women as mad and deviant, and now and these individual expressions also resulted in so many individual tragedies. But what we saw from the 70s was a collective expression of women, and over the last 200 years, after Mary Wollstonecraft's books that had a snowballing effect, we had a collective expressions of women, and how globally it all started with the anti-war movement and civil rights movement, and women started forming their own autonomous women's organizations. Contribution of feminism for academia and the epistemological widening of the horizons of epistemology by bringing in, engendering the mainstream academia, that also she brought out very effectively through case studies and her experiences as a teacher who has been running a course on gender for past 12 years and getting very good response. Then the second presentation was by me on feminism in South Asia. And I started with the 12th century, the whole women's sense in the Bhakti era, and what kind, their lived experiences, their quest for divinity and the day-to-day survival struggle and the material reality, the conflict between that, and how they express their quest for liberation through their verses, through their work. So I gave example of Lal De and Habba Khatun and Mirabai in the 17th century, Behnabai, Janabai, 19th century social reform movement, freedom movement. Women, we know them only as a freedom fighters, but they were also feminist in their personal, in their agenda, where they brought it, they never compromised on women's question. Person like Hansa Mehta, who challenged UDHR because it said the human liberation for the mankind. When that was presented in the UN, she said, no, it should be liberation of the humankind, and human rights of women should be respected. And then we come to the recent new women's rights movement, which started in the 70s as a result of revolutionary movements, which began with the solidarity of Vietnam Revolution and against the imperialist bombing. And so many women who got radicalized, and but they found that women's question was just not taken. It was always women's issues can wait was the approach. And that's why the new women's movement, which started independently organizing, created so much of a pressure at one level, and other level we saw also the academia in that also a dialogical approach and work of anthropologists, economists, sociologists, which question the mainstream academic media, academic endeavor, and they also brought in gender sensibility, women's question to the forefront. And we have 1975 declared as International Women's Year, and 1975 to 85 as International Women's Decade. The collective wisdom that arrived due to collective struggle resulted in a very important kind of solidarity and the acceptance of intersectionality, that it is a interplay of caste, class, race, ethnicity, location, education, that determines the predicament of women. And in South Asia, 8 South Asian countries also had similar trajectory of starting of women's movement and feminist sensibilities and feminist activism and feminist praxis starting after 1970. It's only in Maldives that one doesn't have a documented history, but all other areas, whether it's a Bhutan or Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, we have a documented history of what women's movement and women's studies and feminist activism has done over the last 40 years. And then the third lecture was on transnational feminism, and that was highlighted by Professor Manisha Desai, who has authored several books on this subject. Her articles, dozens of her articles on transnational feminism have been there. She started with her experience as for her PhD thesis. She had chosen a topic of women's movement. She had done the comparative analysis, and then after she went to US, she started working both as an activist, as a sociologist, and as a feminist practitioner. And she gave several examples of transnational solidarities between women in the feminist in North and feminist in South. And she said that we have the solidarity is the only answer, and how in global networks like World Social Forum or other social movement forums, there also you see the gender blindness and why women were feminist in all these global networks had to start women's dialogue. And this dialogue is very important based on understanding of women's reality in a different socio-political cultural context, and the sensitivity with which this thing, it is not that my way or a highway approach. So plurality in all three presentations, plural understanding of feminism that was brought in, that it is it has a democratizing influence, it creates genuine solidarity, and you can't talk about sisterhood is powerful only in as a platitude, but it has to be in a day-to-day lived experiences, and standing by each other when we are facing multiple challenges by the market fundamentalism, because of neoliberalism, cultural nationalism, and fundamentalist attack, and the sectarian attacks that are happening because of the way world capitalism is moving, which is creating more and more chasm and inequality between the haves and the have-nots. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for setting the context for day 2 of the course. I would now like to welcome Dr. Linda Lane for her lecture on intersectional feminism in the industrialized world.
So, thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and see if that works. Let's see. First of all, I'd like to thank IMPRI and Professor Vibhuti Patel for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject together with you today. Actually, I'm coming at it from a very specific point of view, I think, because I'm one of these transnational people who have been, visualizing and experiencing feminisms from a very diverse perspective. I think I should probably say already at the beginning that I'm an American. I live in Sweden. I do research in Sweden, but my emphasis in my research are around how women and feminisms have actually impacted the lives of peoples around the world. And I say peoples because I want to emphasize the fact that oppression is not just something that women experience. And one of the things that has been very close to my mind when I'm doing research, maybe I should point out that I'm an economic historian as well, because that's where my research has been primarily focused on understanding how these kinds of ideas about feminism and intersectionality impacts the ways in which people can make a livelihood, the way we can survive, how can we earn money. So I've been focusing very much on the labor market in my research. So in this very short presentation, I'm going to begin with a few kind of pictures and kind of give you an idea of my perspective and where I'm coming from, and we can talk about it maybe in the questions period, yeah? So I'd like to begin by sharing a picture of someone who might not be might not be known to the Indian public, but this is the picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she died last year, but she's been very much in the public sphere, primarily because of her work around abortion issues in the United States. And she made a very, very famous statement that, in a period when men were complaining about women and their, uppityness, getting involved and wanting to take more space in the public sphere, she said, I'm not asking, I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask is that our brethren, that they take their feet off our necks. That is, we don't need you to help us to be equal, but it would help if you stop stepping on us all the time. So this is a very famous statement, and she's often called the notorious RBG, quite simply because she was very well known in the public sphere and was very well admired by very many people. Another way of kind of coming at this perspective is provided by Patricia Hill Collins. And she just kind of teases out this thing. She says women are differently evaluated based on their perceived value to give birth to the right kind of children to pass on appropriate American values and become worthy symbols of the nation. So what she's saying here is that Black women, white women, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian women, we all occupy different positions within gender, class, and nation. And these are intersecting systems of power. Now, if we look at the statement that is made by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's as if everything is possible. Everything is possible. And you read what Patricia Hill Collins is saying, yeah, it's possible, but there's a hierarchy here that needs to be teased out, that we need to understand when is it possible for we all to be treated the same, and when it's possible that we are not. And how do these kinds of ways of looking at where we are in terms of positions of gender, class, and nation and race, when they intersect, what are the conditions for women who are not the norm? So this is what I think has been the issue for many Black women or women of color, and it's been the discussion about who is feminism for and whose feminism is it that we're talking about. So these are issues that have kind of come up in the, among Black activists, I can imagine the same around Indian activists. I mean, whose feminism is we talking about here? Is it a feminism for everybody, or is it a feminism that's looking at the situation for the norm of white, westernized women? Where do the rest of us fit in? And do we really want to fit into this kind of categorization? So what I want to do in this very short talk is try to explore, as I will, the kind of subtle, understated difference between these two statements. What Ruth Bader Ginsburg is saying is her reality, and the kind of reality that Patricia Hill Collins is talking about. To do that, I'm going to say a few words very briefly about feminism and intersectionality, and I'm going to discuss how categories grounded in social systems of power relations actually reconfigured and manipulated through discourses. That is the way we talk about things we do in our everyday lives, the policies we enact, the practices we practice, and how these get reproduced to facilitate and legitimize the continued subjugation or subordination of certain groups. And I think one of the things that I want to, kind of emphasize here is that all of this doesn't happen at one time. It's like different levels on different places and different contexts. These, I guess you could say that the rapidity of these configurations or manipulations are taking place differently. What is happening in India is maybe completely different on their surface than is what's happening in Sweden or in the United States or in any other place. It is the special historical context that will play out in these situations and how we adapt to them, what we do as feminists, as women, as oppressed men or oppressed others. What we do here is very important. But I guess the point I want to make is that these systems of power relations are not something that we as individuals can control. So I want to argue for a form of intersectional feminism. And I see that as a kind of integrative cultural and materialistic framework that recognizes that humans are stratified through intersections of race, gender, class, and ethnicity, age, caste, and other categories. I mean, these are just some. But I think for me as an economic historian, one of the things that is most powerful here is the way that these kinds of reconfigurations get reproduced that impact the material possibilities of peoples. That is the way stratified societies make it impossible for some groups to make, say, a decent living, to get a job, to educate their children, to take care of elderly, all because they get caught up in these various hierarchies and power relationships. So, what is feminism? And I kind of take a step back here and go back to Rebecca West, because one of the things, that we notice nowadays is that you find a lot of people don't want to call themselves feminist anymore. I'm not a feminist. Or you hear of people who in their actions, in their everyday lives, do not exhibit anything that you would come close to being a kind of a feminist ideology, who say, yes, I'm a feminist. So I'm taking a step back to Rebecca West, the novelist, and she wrote, I have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that when people call me a feminist, whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat. So her point here is that when we as women raise our voices, or we as oppressed peoples with this kind of idea of equality raise our voices, we are considered to be deviant, and then we are kind of overstepping our bounds. So when we think about feminism, and I think it would be, if we look at the people who were prominent in the development of these ideas around feminism, we can say that feminism is many things to many people. And it's kind of a diverse collection of theories and political movements and activisms and, all of these things that kind of take a critical view of the past and present social relationships. It focuses on the social constructions of gender and sexuality and attempts to promote gender equality for women's rights, for interest and issues by focusing on gender policies. Importantly here, I think, are power relationships, are power relations and activism. So in this kind of, very broad spectrum of everything and anything, you maybe could put just about whatever you want into this pot and call it feminism, if you will. But what we agree upon, I think, is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and equal opportunities, and that we emphasize equality, and we do not uphold the idea that one gender is better than another. So, in all the ways we differ, these are things that we can say we are in agreement about. Now, there are certain themes, that are general to feminisms, and I'm just going to mention 4 here. We talk about patriarchy, this kind of male dominance, this disproportionate power concentrated in the hands of men. We talk about how women are stereotyped, these kind of conceptions of gender roles and what we can be, what we should be. All of these things kind of put us at a disadvantage. Added to that is this objectification, this portrayal of women and girls in ways and contexts that tend to minimize us, to subjugate us, to oppress us, to make us as if we are something that can be looked at, ogled, touched. We can be commodified, we can be sold, we can do all of these things to please or to attract, often the male gaze. And of course, oppression and understanding that women are oppressed under patriarchy is different, again, depending on time, place, and context. But in these kind of general themes, I think we are more or less we're in agreement about. But of course, when we talk about feminism, even if we can agree on certain things, there are some things that have created problems. And many of these have to do with the things that I think Professor Patel discussed earlier. I didn't attend the lectures yesterday, but I can see from the texts that are going to be discussed or later on that is going to be discussed even more in depth. That is that much of the feminist theory has been written from the perspective of white, upper middle class, heterosexual, college-educated married women. Nothing wrong with that. We can say we have a lot of debt to be owed to these people because they had the time, the money, and the interest to do it. That does not mean, and I think it has to be very clear here, that their experiences are representative of the experiences of women in general. This has been the major discussion among Black feminists in America. And I think when we look at the discussion about does feminism travel, all of these things that have been issues that have been raised, this has been the discussion by Mohanty, Spivak, and others who have kind of claimed that Western feminism does not represent very well the conditions of people and women outside of the West. Now, of course, in India, I'm sure you have the same kinds of discussions, can the upper middle class, college educated heterosexual woman represent the diversity of women in India? I'm sure these discussions are going on. I don't know enough to be able to say anything, specific about it, but I can imagine that there are groups of women in India who are asking, is this feminism for me? Where do I fit in? How can I make myself, visible among these women who say they represent me or represent all women, but they don't. They have no ideas about the kinds of lives we live, yeah? So the concerns about inequality that are raised by these women, they're very important, but they have neglected to acknowledge that the category of woman is complicated. We are many things. I'm a Black academic living in Sweden who has a completely different kind of position in society than maybe another Black person who had migrated to Sweden, who is not an academic, who's working as a caregiver, perhaps. We are women, but we have different experiences, and we need to take that and keep those things in mind when we're talking about the feminism we want for the future. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that a failure to acknowledge a privilege, being one of those who can voice yourself and make yourself heard, is kind of a problem. We need to kind of be aware that all of us, under certain conditions, have unearned right and advantage, or sometimes even immunity. We can get away with a lot more. Yeah. So we need to keep that in mind when we are talking about feminisms as well. Now, if we come to intersectionality, and I just want to touch on this briefly because I know it's going to be talked about more later. But this is a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was kind of like the one who really articulated this idea of intersectionality in a way that we could operationalize it in policy. And she talks about the fact that, as well as Patricia Hill Collins, about our multiple identities, and how they kind of intersect to create identities and the ways that we get privileged or not privileged, oppressed or are not by the way we are defined. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just want to bring this up because it helps me transition to what I think is the most important issue today. Where do we go from here? What can we do? And I think this idea of a kind of intersectional feminism is the way forward. For that reason, I was very happy when I was asked to talk about this, because I know it kind of makes us aware of the fact that feminism is good. It's not bad. It's something that can help us kind of make changes and see the kind of possibilities for sisterhood, if you will. But it also demands that we open up to be able to see how we differ. And we need this kind of view, I think, because feminism as we practice it has yet to fully recognize, to be inclusive of, to analyze or implement policies and practices that consider the marginalization of women based on layered multiple identities, gendered aspects of racial and ethnic discrimination, the racialized aspects of gender discrimination, and the sexualized aspects of gender and racial discrimination. So we have this kind of, feminism, the good old school, if you will, but it needs to be problematized. It needs to be kind of, to open up itself to understand the way marginalization functions and the way we as women are also a part of this kind of oppressive structure when we don't or when we fail to take into account these things. Yeah. So, one of the things that has kind of sustained me in thinking about this is the fact that women have, talked about this kind of intersectional framework and tried to detail and pick out how the holes in feminist descriptions kind of derail or kind of make other women invisible. So we have women and we have a body of knowledge now that has started to discuss these issues. So we can say now that when we know these things, if we're going to go forward, we need to have a feminist movement that, takes into consideration how these early feminist movements might have alienated women or various groups, or made us feel that we weren't a part of them, or maybe that we were not welcome. So, it also means that if we want to have a way forward, we mustn't think about practicing a feminism that does not ignore intersections, the reality that all women share all others' axes of identity. It is a theoretical approach, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of looking, it's a way of seeing, but it's also important to note that intersections are just a snapshot in time. Intersectionality is not going to save us. It's going to make us see what is possible. And then we have to create practices and policies around it that is going to make the difference. I thought this was kind of an appropriate picture. Again, it's about America, the United States, and then of course that's kind of can be a little bit of a problem, but this is Billie Jean King, and on the one side of her is Serena Williams, and the other is Naomi, what is her last name now? Oh, I can't remember, but she's also an up-and-coming new young tennis player. And the point, that Billie Jean King here makes is it's hard to understand inclusion if you've been excluded. And this picture, I think, represents at least this kind of inclusion, exclusion in an American context. Here is Billie Jean King, who was one of the top women tennis players of her time, a white woman who had all of the advantages, but was still excluded. She didn't earn as much. She was not allowed to participate in the right kind of tournaments. All of these things set against her. And on both sides of her are two Black identifying women who have been able to make advantages or take advantage of changes in time and space, but are still kind of excluded in terms of wage earning, possibilities, all of these things. So I think it's kind of important here to kind of pay attention to these things. She says, that this is the century of women. People are finally understanding that until you bring women out of poverty, until you stop discounting them and treating them like slaves, humanity cannot move forward. And I think that is a lesson, it's a quote that is applicable to all of us. I want to just kind of, before I end here, just kind of talk about what intersectional feminism does and what it does not do. First of all, intersectionality or intersectional feminism is not just for the so-called oppressed. And I say this because we all, male, female, Black, white, are part of what I call this kind of intersectionality dance. That is, sometimes we are oppressed and sometimes we are privileged. And it will all depend on where we are and what we are doing in which context and where we are historically, how this will play out. So we cannot ignore the fact that we are also, I guess you say, kind of part of the problem. So we need to think about that. It may be uncomfortable to recognize the domination and oppression present in our own lives. The point is, ignoring it won't make it go away. So we have to embrace the fact, understand the fact that just now in this position, when I'm speaking to you as a Black academic with a lot of status in the Swedish context, I'm using my power to say something which may not at all be as effective if I was kind of trying to do the same in a Swedish context with, where my male colleagues would probably have more clout. So I think we have to, or other women in that case, I would say, maybe other women professors who had another point of view. My point is here, we cannot ignore the fact that we are both oppressors or oppressed, and that we also have privilege. And intersectional feminism is personal, and it is inclusive, and it requires empathy. We need to think about how we can not only take, but what we can give. It is also a feminism that is anchored in grassroots movements and activism. As Professor Patel said earlier, this kind of growing out of the civil rights movement, the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, these are very important, stages for us and something to rest on, to know that, okay, we can do this. It is possible, but we need to do it together. At the same time, we need to recognize that these kind of movements and activism demands that we kind of open up our perspective to seeing things differently, to dare to cross borders of class, race, ethnicity, culture, whatever. So I'm going to kind of end my little talk with a picture of Audre Lorde. And I think it's kind of important because she says, women are powerful and dangerous. And I think we are, yeah? The quote I want to end with is, she says that the failure of academic feminists to recognize difference as a crucial strength is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. In our world, divide and conquer must become define and empower. So we need to rise above patriarchy and see what we have in common, to not allow ourselves to be divided and conquered, but together define and empower ourselves for the future. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the very enriching analysis. I would now like to pose some questions from the audience. Sweta Rupa Mishra asks, does intersectional feminism resonate with personal is political?
Yes, it does, but it takes a step beyond that, because this personal is political. For me, okay, I'm speaking from my own point of view. I have, I think it's kind of based in this kind of individualistic perspective. And I think while that is important, we need to understand that when we move beyond me to we have more collective power, and together we can maybe kind of gather strength to kind of really make some impact on this kind of patriarchal societies. And I'm back here with Audre Lorde. She said, when we are together, we are powerful. when we are, when we are alone as individuals, that does not mean our voices cannot be heard. But then again, we are kind of caught up in where we are, whose voices get heard in that case, If we're together, then we're many. So I'm going to go for collective solutions myself.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the okay. There is one by Kevna Desai. How would you differentiate between subaltern, postmodern feminism and intersectional feminism?
Wait. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer that question. But I think this kind of postmodern idea is, where identities are very important. And from my perspective, I think it has given a lot of new ideas, new theories, but I think as well it can be very divisive, where identity policy comes at the forefront. It means that we often fail to see again the commonalities between groups. If I mean, this is a part of the discussion in the American context, and I'm sure it is here that, Black identity or this critical race theory that has been very on the forefront of people's minds. And of course, I think it does tend to get a bad reputation because people quite simply don't understand what it means. But I think what happens is when we get so tied up with who we identify with, or what specific group, we cannot see how these specific identities actually intersect at different ways. My Black identity intersects with my economic possibilities, my educational opportunities. So again, I'm thinking that, the postmodern approaches in themselves will not solve the problem of subordination or oppression. I think we have to, it may be a place to start. It may be, this idea of we together, when I, as a Black woman, can have a commonality with other Black women in the same position. We can have some ideas about what we want. But we are still a minority group. If we want to change things, then we have to find ways of kind of communicating those issues to a wider society so that we together can go forward. So again, I'm back in this kind of collective idea.
Pallavi Singh says, Dr. Lane, there was a line in your paper that struck out to me. What happens in Sweden is of importance quite simply because if gender equality cannot be attained here, then what is the prognosis for the rest of the world? As a non-binary person in a developing country, I would like to hear your thoughts on LGBTQIA+ rights and the community's integration in the formal economy globally.
Okay, yeah, in the Swedish context, equality is, it's a policy, it's aspirational, it's something we're working toward. It's the idea, that we are equal. And of course, when you write about Sweden or you hear about Sweden, it's the most gender equal country in the world, it says. I would say that on paper, that is quite true. But in practice, of course, there are problems, there are differences. We make differences between people. The difference, I think, is once you have our institutional framework, that is, you have a law in place, then the person or persons who experience themselves as being discriminated can challenge that. They can, if you're discriminated at work or in the health services or at school, you have a law or an institution that you can go and say, I demand my right to not be discriminated. And of course, it's, as we talk about this difference between policy and practice, does that mean that people do not get discriminated? No, it does not. Compared to other places in the world, to be non-binary, I would say Sweden is probably physically probably one of the safest, in the sense that you're not attacked for your physical, based on your physical body. You're kind of welcomed into society in that respect. But of course, there are subtle ways of discriminating, which are made possible even in the Swedish context. So pluses, yes. Minuses, they are there too.
Thank you. Monica Merchant asks, apart from spreading awareness, are there any steps we can take to reduce intersectional discrimination?
Yeah, I think we can start with ourselves and, in our everyday lives. What we do to each other, with each other, is very important. Okay, I'm kind of like making this kind of general statements about advocating and things like that. But in any point in time, you will be challenged by these intersectionalities. And I would say that on the average, you do not even know that they are occurring. You do not see yourself as being privileged or oppressed in every single act that you do every day. You just don't, it's only when you take a step back and reflect over, why didn't I get that job? Or why wasn't I included in that group that was working on this project? Is it because of my caste? Or is it because I'm considered too old? Or is it because I'm an American and everybody else here is Swedish? So it's only when we reflect on this, or somebody else, takes it forward for us, that we really become aware of this. Aha, maybe I should have, done something here instead. This awareness of our, possibility to reflect means that we can kind of, in a more and more digitalized world, I think people are finding ways of kind of putting it out there. Whether it's on Facebook or Instagram or wherever, they make the point, and then they find that, aha, there are other people who are experiencing the same kinds of conditions as myself. How can we go together? Or shall we? Will we? Do we want to? Or is it just a way of kind of finding some opportunity to discuss? And I think that, discussion and reflection is always this first step to activism, from my point of view. Yeah.
Thank you. Arjun S. says, thanks for a lucid presentation. Can intersectional feminism bring all the strands together in a common weave, despite serious chasms?
No. I mean, if that worked, then, our job would be done. We would not need to have these kinds of conferences and educational opportunities. If that worked, it doesn't. And then, that is the task that we are set as activists, as academics, as students, to try to understand that this is not like the silver bullet, or what you say, it's not like the one theory that fits everything. It is a way of opening up for discussion, for reflection, for thinking. But this is just one step in the direction. So we have to keep, our eyes and ears open and kind of keep aware of what is happening around us. On the other hand, I do feel that, in a more and more globalized world, and perhaps where I do most of my work, is I'm understanding that what happens in India and what happens in Sweden and what happens in the United States are intrinsically linked to each other, whether we like it or not. Internet, global migration, global capitalism, neoliberalism, all of these things are pulling us both closer together, but also drawing us further and further apart. And realizing that, these are things that are happening around us can make us more aware. But is this the be all and do all of their theoretical approaches? No, it's not. It's just one in our arsenal, I think, of theoretical tools that we can use to try to make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you. Ipshita Mitra asks, can equality work effectively without achieving equity? Is it equality a utopian concept without making equity a possible reality for people from the marginal locations?
This is an ongoing discussion, and I understand it, and I'm, it's sometimes I'm of two minds. Shall we count how many men and women are here? How many of this sort of women, and how many of this sort of women, or that sort of women? Or should we look at it, and because equity means you're going to have this idea of you're going to have as many as what it looks like, yeah. But I don't know. I'm thinking about historically in the United States, we have this kind of equal opportunity laws that says, I think it may be kind of similar in some respects to what is going on in India. For Black people or minority people in America, you have these equal opportunity laws that says that if they're underrepresented in a business or a college or a school or whatever, then the employer should make accommodations to see that the underrepresented person is valued higher. Now, of course, this looks very good, and I think for many people, equal opportunity laws have been very important, and especially in the American way. And I would say in Sweden, where equal opportunity has been very much a part of getting the same number of women represented in a workplace or whatever, that has been very important. Maybe there were other ways of solving this. I don't know. So I'm of two minds. I like the idea of, equality every, 50-50 everywhere, but equity can also be, kind of maybe a solution in some cases. I don't have an answer for you there.
Thank you. Supriya Gandhi asks, what are the challenges before intersectional feminism? Does the growing fundamentalism around the world pose any kind of challenge?
Yes. And this is because we are retreating into these kind of nationalistic context. As I said before, on the one hand, you have this kind of globalization and neoliberalism and capitalistic expansion, which is saying that, okay, the world is one, we should all be together, and capitalism is demanding rights of, to produce things and to have people consume them all over the world. And this is, of course, being pushed around by the internet and campaign ads, etc. On the other hand, you have these kinds of situations where migration is being curtailed, where people, we want lots of people to come to our countries, but only the right kind, or the right sort, or from the right place. We want jobs, but only for the right people, with the right skin color or the right age or the right education. So on the one hand, I think these ideas about intersectionality on the surface is being driven by these kinds of globalization and neoliberalism, but it is being, pushed back at the same time by nationalistic instincts that says, come here, but not any further. So, we have, say, for example, in the Swedish case, we have undersupply of employees, of workers. But, there are nationalistic tendencies here. This is, well, we need workers, but we don't need this kind of worker. We want that kind of worker. And those kinds of workers that maybe the Swedish nationalists want are not people who would choose Sweden. So, okay, maybe I'm kind of wandering around here a bit, but my point is that you have this push-pull of globalization that is kind of creating a situation where nationalistic pushbacks are affecting the possibility to kind of have some kind of integrated, what can I call it, for a kind of making this possibility for an intersectional approach to things like labor markets and livelihoods. It's kind of making it more difficult nowadays. I would say that, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that really answered the question. I wandered around there a bit, but you know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Amrita Tripathi asks, Dr. Lane, some feminists critique intersectionality, like Mary E. John. What's your take on it?
Mary
E. John.
Mary John, is that she's the historian from University of Delhi, right? Is this the lady? I'm not really sure if I know the person, John.
Yes, from the Center for Women's Development Studies.
Yeah. Mm.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. I think I recognize. I don't really know enough about her to be able to say anything there. But I would say that there, of course, are differences in how we, you know, how we want to become involved with intersectionality. Of course, everybody, again, we're talking from positions of privilege. My view is that, you know, again, this kind of it has its positive effects, or the possibilities for positive effects, but it's not going to solve the problem. It's just going to show us what the problem is. It's what we do once we recognize the problem is going to make a difference. So if, you know, if I observe that at this point in time, these kinds of, you know, intersectional contexts are happening, that, for example, I'm just going to say something about Crenshaw and her famous case, when she realized that in the courts in America, when women who were demanding that, you know, not to be discriminated in work, when she understood that the law could only take one category at a time into view, of course, that was the problem. So the law could only look at them as women, and it couldn't look at them as racialized women. So, you know, once we realize that this is the case, then we can act. So this could be about ageism or about religious preferences or sexuality or whatever. But I think, you know, once we realize it, then we can act. But until then, intersectionality as a theoretical tool is just a tool. It doesn't solve the problem. It just shows it to us. Yeah. And I don't know where Mary John stands on this, but yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And the last question is by Apurva Das. How can intersectionality help achieve gender equality, where standpoint feminism states individual perspective and intersectionality states collective perspective of one's identity? How will both the idea of feminism intersect and can help achieve gender equality? Wouldn't they clash with each other?
Yeah. And this is probably when going back to what I said before about this kind of identity policies, identity theories, you know, when we get so involved in individual identities that we cannot see the whole, it makes it the situation much more difficult on the one hand. On the other, by understanding our identities, it makes us stronger in our identities, you know, understanding who I am and my position as a Black woman or as a Dalit woman or as whatever. That gives me some sustainability. It gives me some support in who I am. But the next step must be to move beyond my identity just now to see how my identity as whatever category or combination of categories that I embrace, how these two together can move forward. because the point I've been trying to make all the time is that as minority identities in the big wild world, we must find colleagues, we must find partners, we must find other women or who are identifying in another way, maybe, but try to see what the commonalities are so that we as a group can move forward, or as a collaboration of identities. Maybe that's asking too much, but I really believe that, you know, one identity at a time is not going to solve the problem for us. We need to move forward together. Is that easy? No, it isn't, because if it were, then women like myself or my mom and her sisters wouldn't have felt left out of the first feminist movement. You know, they wouldn't have felt that there was nothing there for them. So the idea is that we must maybe embrace our separate identities, but to affect change, we maybe have to kind of move forward together. And, you know, that's one of the kind of, maybe for me, the most important aspects of the third wave movement was that you saw women of all colors and shapes and forms and ages doing things together. Were they completely in agreement about every step of the way forward? No, they were not. And it's going to be bitter and nasty, and it's not going to be neat and clean. But I mean, women are dangerous. We are powerful when we do things together, so we can do that. But it's not going to be like a walk in the park. That I don't. And until we realize that, you know, then I don't think we can achieve equality. I really truly don't, because if we are trying all the time to kind of achieve equality by putting one person, one group ahead of another, then we are dividing. We have to define and empower together. That's my point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lane, for your reflections and for answering all the questions.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to conclude your lecture in another few minutes?
Yeah, well, you know, I can just say that the questions have made me think a lot, and I'm not really sure that I've given them the focus they really deserve, because I think they were very complex and they require a lot of us. I hope that in the coming lectures, and when I look at the schedule, I see that, you know, you're going to be talking about intersectionality more in depth. You're going to be looking, so maybe some of the things that are the holes that I failed to fill in this lecture will be filled by others in the coming lectures. I hope so. From my position, again, it's been a real pleasure. It kind of made me think again about who I am and what I want to do as a feminist. It kind of forced me to take a step outside of my comfort zone to think about who I am as a teacher and a lecturer at a university in Sweden. But all in all, I don't really have so much more to add except to say thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would now like to invite Professor Indira Ramarao for a lecture on feminist epistemology and feminist praxis.
Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Thank you. Good evening to all my friends here. First of all, I would like to thank IMPRI and Professor Vibhuti Patel for this opportunity. And I really do not know whether a lot of what I'm going to say would be anything new, because yesterday, the 3 illustrious lectures and just now the erudite presentation by Professor Linda Lane has already, I think, set the stage, and many of the issues that I want to raise have already come. So first, I would, if it sounds repetitive, sorry about that. Second, I do not have a PPT because basically I like talking, and somehow I feel that PPT kind of, just takes away my concentration, and that's why I'm not comfortable, very comfortable. But as I told Vibhuti, I've written down the points that I want to make so that I don't, overshoot the time that has been given to me. So with this small introduction, I would like to start. Well, as you all know, my topic is feminist narratives in the mother tongue, voices for social transformation and justice. Before I start, I'll just share with you the framework for my presentation. I just first would like to start with the terminology of feminism, talk a little about that, and then ask another question: how does feminism express itself? So I have some, subsections under that heading. First of all, I like to look at feminism as freedom of expression. And how do we express ourselves? There is feminism in language, feminism as theory, feminism as a way of life, which I consider very important, and feminism in writing, which includes the style of writing. And that's what I'm going to majorly talk about today. And the third part of it is feminism as language, which can either be through speaking or writing. So I'll now limit myself to writing, in which the three main issues I want to raise are language, content, and style of writing. And in this section, I would like to discuss, the four writers: Akamahadevi, who wrote in Kannada, and Lalita Antarbika Janam, who wrote in Malayalam, and Lalitambika Antarjanam, who wrote in Malayalam, Olga, who writes in Telugu, and Bama, who writes in Tamil. And I'll end my presentation by very briefly summing up what I make out of these discussions. So I'll start by talking about the terminology of feminism. And I think that this issue has come up since yesterday quite a few times, about what feminism is actually about. So when you ask the question, what is feminism? I don't think it can have one single answer. To quote Bhasan and Khan, I quote, "It can and does change because feminism is based on historically and culturally concrete realities and levels of consciousness, perceptions, and actions." Now, this is to be understood as an awareness of women's oppression. I would understand from whatever little I have read and all the lectures that I have listened to and my own participation in the women's movement, I would look at feminism as something that creates an awareness of women's oppression, the deprivations they experience because of their gender, and the various forms of open and subtle violence they suffer from in all social institutions. That is the first part of it. The second part, because I saw that there were also questions on how we can translate this into action to bring about equality. So the second part of feminism, as I understand it, is, and more importantly, a conscious effort to counter, question, and alter gender-based inequalities. So I'm of the view that the meaning of feminism cannot be limited only to challenging or transforming gender-induced inequalities. I think it goes beyond. And that is how I understand intersectionality. And it's because gender violence is a direct consequence of multiple forms of discrimination created by caste, race, religion, class, ethnicity, location, sexual orientation, age, disability, a lack of social capital, and many others. So to me, feminism cannot just be rooted in one concept or one ideology. In fact, I'm often intrigued by the classifications we come across in feminist discourses, such as Western feminism, indigenous feminism, and all the other subcategorizations that we make. Of course, I understand that each type of feminism is very important, and it puts up a certain point of view. And as Professor Lane was just now saying, there is need to bring it together. There is need for collectivity. Then only I think we can understand that concept very clearly. And feminism, this is something which all of us know. It's multifaceted, diverse, accepts and respects difference, and permits comparison, and does not look down upon any voice of protest, and does not attach meanings to early or contemporary efforts at defining hegemonic values and practices. And I think it's a summation of all the paths that have been charted out at different points of time and in different historical, cultural contexts. Because I have often heard discussions, where people say, oh, that's nothing today. After all, what's so great about it? We are living in the 21st century. But I think that historical, cultural context and the time period, because the Akamahadevi, about whom I'm going to talk of, and yesterday Vibhuti talked about her. When she lived, what she did in the 12th century was definitely protest. Whether you want to call her a feminist or not, it's a question of terminology. That's why I said. But you cannot just condemn certain forms of protest by certain groups and certain individuals as non-feminist and say that they mean nothing for us. But given the point of time in which they took place, and given the fact that they tried in their own small way or big way, whatever you want to say, to question stereotypes, I think that while going through the trajectory of feminism, these must be included. And I would like to quote, Rosemary Tong, who says, there are as many types of feminism as there are women. And, she said, by examining our differences, we achieve unity. My argument is that in trying to decolonize and deconstruct colonial symbols, such as patriarchy, power hierarchies, caste class, hegemony, and intolerance of diversity, we shouldn't create new colonies which, include all these forms of violence. Now I go to the second point. How does feminism express itself? This is a question that bothered me while I was a student and also after I started teaching. Okay, we hear so much about feminism, but where do you see that? Is it just a theory? Is it a practice? Is it an ideology? You see it, where do you see that? So as I said, feminism to me is something that gives me the freedom of choice in several areas. So the next question that I propose to address is, how does feminism express itself? I see it as the freedom of choice to speak or write in the language of comfort, the category into which, writing in the mother tongue, which is, the main subject of my talk today, it would come under that category. I call it the language of comfort, to use or not to use a theoretical frame of reference, and the way we lead our lives. As for using a language, either when we are speaking or writing feminism, I'm of the view that any language in which I feel comfortable, I can share my lived experiences and bring to fore the situations which surround me in different institutions with which I'm associated in different capacities. That is to be my medium of expression. There is a feeling among many, even to this day, that if you do not use English, you're not engaging in serious academic discourse. I wrote a column in a fortnightly Kannada daily for almost 4.5 years. And many of my columns, they were either responding to certain social issues, and most of them were on gender. So I used to have calls from people, and sometimes, with all due respect to certain senior colleagues who used to say, why are you wasting your time? Why are you writing like this in Kannada? Why don't you write in English? Why don't you increase your publication output? I said, no, thank you, but then I feel comfortable. And my aim is to reach out to people in a language that they understand, and by taking examples around me. And so much so that when something happened, especially in the gender domain, And if I took a little time, because it was a fortnightly column and I could write only once in 15 days, there used to be calls of people who say, why are you keeping quiet? Why are you not saying anything? We expected you to react. So you see, I felt very comfortable writing in the language with which I was very conversant and familiar, and with the language through which I could reach out. So I think in feminism, my argument here is, and I am sure this has already come up, we should not restrict the expression of feminist thinking, feminist practice in any language. That's one thing. And then the other thing I want to say is, this is a feeling, and sometimes, they use words like native, populist, grassroots. No, I think knowledge, nor its sources, can be subjugated in any manner. See, because there is so much of wealth of words available in any language, we tend to sometimes categorize writing in the mother tongue or in any language of comfort that is non-English in certain circles. I'm not generalizing, as something that is, they're okay, populist literature. But I think that you have to talk and speak and be heard in the public domain. So the knowledge sources are multiple. Only some have a claim to authenticity, they say. But feminism, which is meant to question stereotypes and create a world where nobody develops either inferiority complex or superiority complex, it must give the freedom to use the language of one's choice as a medium of expression. Now, I will not dwell much on theory, but I cannot, say that I will go away from that area when talking about feminism, because there is a feeling that if you do not place your writing or speech in a theoretical mold, your discourse is not complete. Well, I feel that there should not be a preoccupation with theorizing and esoteric epistemology, as it can shift attention from documenting many lived experiences of people, especially in the margins. Now, let me make it clear that I'm not undermining the importance of theory or its contribution to the growth of feminist knowledge or any form of knowledge for that matter, because we've all learned a lot from different strands of theories. But there is a question, which I confronted long ago. I saw this in one of the publications. Now, in gender studies, when you're talking of the violence against women, when you're talking about the experiences that women are going through, should all of these be put in the context of a feminist theory only? Or do you use the narrative model, the narrative mold to express what somebody went through? When I talk of my experiences, when I share it with people, should it be in the context of a theory only? I think that we must engage very seriously in this debate, because this is something which keeps bothering us many times. I will frankly say that as an examiner of many dissertations, I have also asked this question: which theory have you used? So yeah, it only says you should have read, you should have got ideas, you should have got inspiration. So definitely, I'm not saying that there should not be a theoretical discourse in writing about gender or in writing about any form of discrimination. But let's question, when you talk of gender, whether it has to be in the context of a feminist theory. There are so many of them. Or do you go on narrating your lived in experiences? So this is a question that I consider is very important while discussing the language of feminism and the form in which it should be expressed. Now, I'm just touching upon another very critical aspect vis-a-vis feminism. I think that one of the ways feminism expresses itself is the way in which we lead our lives. Because one of the most visible expressions of feminism is the way in which we adopt it in our day-to-day lives. So the use of language, I'm again coming back to that, especially the language which is the mother tongue, transmits not only gender stereotypes, but also messages for transformation, which is one of the themes of this session. Now, I especially look at the spoken language as a very powerful tool for intergenerational transformations in values, attitudes, and practices that undermine women, girl children, and those with a different gender orientation. The words that one uses, especially in the mother tongue, which do not respect values and practices of gender equality, are being transferred from one generation to the other and are even tolerated. But to me, when feminism becomes a way of life, it would include reacting to the use of such language and condemning it. I will not take examples here, nor will I name people, but in Kannada itself, there are certain words, which are used even in official domain, in academic domain, and in the public domain, to belittle women, men also by taking the name of women. When they say you are so and so, this is so insulting. This is terribly discriminatory, but this is being tolerated. Even as late as last month, there was a huge battle between two political groups when, they accused each other by using language which said, are you wearing bangles? I have been hearing this ever since I was a child, and today in a public platform, they're using this. So to me, when I look at feminism, as a way of life, I think it's very important to challenge this kind of use of language, whether it is in the mother tongue or whether it is in any language. I'm sure these words are there. So to me, when I say way of life, these are very important, and the language component, the medium of expression, is very important. Now, in the background of some of these thoughts on feminism, I come to the subject which I propose to discuss by taking up the works of 4 writers in 4 languages, Kannada, Malayalam, Telugu, and Tamil, as example of powerful feminist writings in the mother tongues of these writers. These have left deep imprints on progressive literature which challenged patriarchy. Before I go to these 4 writers individually, I would like to clarify that, taking the time at my disposal, I have tried to just take the main points. So it's not that, I've covered the entire gamut of their writings, but I just would like to say how they have contributed to the rise of protest literature, as I call it, because to me, feminist writing is also protest literature. I'll start with Akamahadevi, the Kannada poetess of 12th century, whose writings, your writer, Anthology, once said, Akamahadevi is not just a memory, but is active in the writings of many women poets who are writing in Kannada. Now, Mahadevi is her name. This Akka, the word, in Kannada, which means elder sister, it was an honor that was conferred on her in a place called Anubhava Mantapa. You see, a place where Veerashaiva intellectuals discussed many issues relating to caste discrimination, gender discrimination, etc. Because the Veerashaiva movement of Karnataka was one of the earliest movements, as way back in 12th century, which did not discriminate entry of people on the basis of caste. So Mahadevi, when she went into this particular place and took part in the discourse, this was a title that was given to her out of sheer respect. So now to quickly go through her life and how, she wrote in Kannada, and even to this day, her writings have left such an indelible imprint on minds of writers, on the women's movement itself, and she's been quoted and she's been translated. You see, all the works of these 4 writers, most of them are available in English, and so we can get a feel of what they wrote. And so Mahadevi, about this one thing I want to tell you about Akamahadevi. You see, she was born in Shimoga district of Karnataka. But about her personal life, see how the world of patriarchy looks at a woman. There are 2 versions. One version is that she, it's her beauty that enamored the local chieftain called Kaushika, who, demanded that her parents get her married to him. But Mahadevi's devotion, because she came from the tradition of the Bhakti movement, as Vibhuti yesterday said, was concentrated on Channamallikarjuna. That is another form of Shiva. Now, if you get into the argument of whether belief in God or that kind of devotion to God is feminist or not, or progressive or not, that's going to go in another track. But in the 12th century, this poetess, considered Lord Channamallikarjuna as her goal, and that place where she wanted to go was Sri Shaila. But because of that pressure, which the king put on her parents, she got married, but laid down certain conditions that he should not disturb her when she is worshipping, etc. But one of the versions tells us that when he did that, she just threw all the material wealth, she discarded her clothes, covered her body with her long hair, walked out. But I remember, years ago when I was talking about Akka's Vachanas, and when I said this, there were some people in the audience who came and literally kind of attacked me and said, no, she was not married. How can you talk of a woman who, could do all this if she were to be married to somebody? So this is a wrong version. So I said, this is only one version I have said, but they were not ready to accept. They said, no, she's a goddess herself. You are trying to undermine her persona by talking like this. And I left it at that. But the other version is that, of course, she walked out of her family in search of this God. Now, you see, there are two things that Akamahadevi challenged. Her verses called as Vachanas were written in simple Kannada. It's kind of spoken Kannada. And everybody could understand what she wrote, but there was protest. She's supposed to have written more than 400 Vachanas. Many of them have been translated into English. But you see, where the two things, according to me, which she challenged were the institution of marriage and the dress code, about which so much discussion goes on. You see, by rejecting the material wealth is another thing, but by throwing off her clothes, by saying that I don't care for the body, because in feminism, feminist discourses, we talk so much about body. So Mahadevi's Vachanas are among the earliest rebellions against oppression based on gender, caste, ritualism, monogamy. By rejecting clothes, Mahadevi challenged the notion of the female body as, a seat of purity, as something that needs to be protected from public gaze. And she also challenged the notion of husband as God. There are writings in Kannada which have said Mahadevi challenged the notion of husband as God, and did the reverse by considering the God as her husband. And then, so though Akka's track is set in the Bhakti mold, and there are discussions as to whether she could be considered a feminist, her Vachanas, which said that it is not physical features. I'm very impressed. I think this is a very important Vachana of Akamahadevi, which is truly feminist. This is what we have all been talking. It is not physical features that determine a person's personality. She asks the question, is knowledge male or female? Does knowledge have a gender? No. So Akamahadevi, one is of course known quite well because of the English translations of her Vachanas that are available. However, we cannot, say, sometimes when we are talking of waves of feminism, it keeps coming to my mind that what about the feminist writings that were written in the mother tongue across the country, which could not be classified as feminist, are not classified as feminist, but I think they laid the foundation. Now, quickly, the other writer about who is not there anymore is Lalitambika Antarjanam, whose works in Malayalam have left a deep mark on how feminist literature in Kerala shaped up. Because Lalitambika, she was born in 1909 in Kerala in a Nambudiri Brahmin family. Now, Nambudiris lived by a strict patriarchal order, which gave no freedom to women either to make their life choices or seek a break from the isolated confines of their homes. In fact, the term Antarjanam in her name literally means one who lives in the interior. Women who tried to question gender-induced violence were cast out and ostracized by their families. She was one of the few girls in the Nambudiri community who was able to get some education because of her progressive father. She was also exposed to the changes taking place in the larger Kerala society and the country. Lalitambika was drawn to the nationalist movement and was especially influenced by the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, whose portrayal of women in traditional Bengali society in his writings had made a mark on her. So Lalitambika's writings included 9 volumes of short stories, poems, children books, and a novel called Agnisakshi and her own autobiography. Now, in her writings, one could see a women's world, which was engulfed in abuse by a patriarchal system. She also brought out in her writings the severity of social inequalities present in the Kerala society of her days, such as untouchability, unapproachability, gender prejudices, and the role that rituals played in oppressing women. Also, her writings bring out the question of the dress code for Nambudiri women. See, Mahadevi rejected the dress code in 12th century. And in the 20th century, here was Lalitambika Antarjanam rejecting the dress code that was imposed on Nambudiri women by throwing the umbrella, by throwing that over shawl, which they were supposed to cover themselves with all the time. So she admits that she derived the inspiration from other women who had done it even before she could do it. So in one of her works, you see, she brings out the cruel realities of patriarchal men who used rituals to harass women and young girls, and also the courage of those who rebelled against these oppressive practices. So in her work, sometimes you see how, there has been a backlash by some women, only a small number, against patriarchy and male hegemony. So Gayatri Devi, who refers to Lalitambika as a writer who shaped Kerala's feminist literature, she writes, the conversations she started about women's rights and rules reach well into our own intellectual and social engagements about the human rights of women. Probably I'll finish in another 10 minutes. The next writer about whom I want to talk about, though very briefly, is Olga, which is her pen name, is a Telugu writer whose name is Lalita Kumari. She's a strong proponent. Today we're talking of sisterhood. One of the ideologies of the feminist movement is that sisterhood is very powerful. And she uses this ideology in her most well-known book called Vimukta, which she wrote in Telugu, which has been translated into English, in which she uses the epic Ramayana to retell stories of characters who have not been given their space. So translated in English as The Liberation of Sita, this book brings out the bonding that develops between Sita and characters like Ahalya, Shurpanaki, Urmila, who were never central characters in this epic. And it also gives a different portrayal of Ravana's wife, Mandodari. But these portrayals have attracted, no doubt, when Olga wrote this and papers published that either as, or they were serialized, newspapers have been attacked and she has been threatened with attacks for, trying to revision an epic. But her argument was that you should use myths and mythology to question, to revisit, and to re-look at these characters and portray them in a different way to challenge brotherhood concept and sisterhood. And so it's very important to talk of women's alliances and friendships. In Olga's writings, you can experience this, that what she calls a sisterhood is like the women's alliances and friendships, which become mutually learning experiences. And the last writer that I would like to talk about is Bama. That again is her pen name, is a Tamil writer who focuses on caste discrimination and other forms of social discrimination as well. But she's known for demolishing the hypocrisy that surrounds the use of so-called, polished language. Her autobiography, Karuku, which has again been translated into English by Lakshmi Hallstrom, is called an autobiographical novel, but Bhama even challenges the use of the word autobiography, because this Karuku broke several stereotypes in writing and use of language. It brought out the multiple layers of exploitation with Dalit Christian women experience. Karuku means, palmyra leaf. Karuku in Tamil, translated into English, means palmyra leaf, is the first autobiographical account, it is said, that has been written in Tamil. It by a woman, and it chronicles her life from childhood to adulthood and brings out her experiences in the church and its institutions. It's not just a chronological journey of events in her life, but takes the reader through a trajectory of her moments of oppression. Now, lastly, the question that before I close, I would like to bring this out. Should women writers write their experiences? Is it not personal? Bama says that it is not categorizations that matter. And I think this applies to many of the writings which are feminist. Why should I structure my writings according to standard notions of autobiography or any other genre? The language I use, she herself says, is raw, spoken by people. She herself says it is dirty, but it has its own beauty because, any person likes his or her mother tongue, which is beautiful. So I would like to conclude by saying, you see that when women write in their mother tongue, in a language in which they are comfortable, in a language in which they chronicle their lived experiences, they feel very comfortable, the reader feels very comfortable. Often they say, you are writing stories, who is interested? Talk about something which is there. Who wants to know what you are going through? But I think that what women go through when expressed in a language, which may not be, what you call academic language as such, it does leave an imprint. So all I want to say is that narrative form, because, women, many times women are told, girls are told, you talk too much. No, I think there is also a historical angle to that. They were not asked to talk. They didn't want them to talk. They didn't want them to ask questions. But I think now has come the time to speak, to write, and to do feminism in mother tongue. It's fine to do it in English for those who are comfortable. But then using mother tongue as the medium, I think is something that needs to be stressed. And we should talk more about all these writers across the country who have broken the barriers and tried to give their best. Thank you, and I apologize if I have taken more time.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramarao, for the very insightful lecture. I would like to pose some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Thank you. Nagmani Rao says, it struck me while listening to you. For years, we have been highlighting patriarchal and Brahmanical influence on express language. Yet when we talk of our language of comfort, we refer to it as mother tongue. Your thoughts on what I perceive as a contradiction?
So will you please read that again? Oops.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, what happened?
Sorry.
Sorry.
No issues.
I can hear you. Please go ahead. I'll probably go back and.
It struck me while listening to you.
Okay.
For years, we have been highlighting patriarchal and Brahmanical influence on express language.
Express language, is it?
Expressed.
Okay.
Yet, when we talk of our language of comfort, we refer to it as our mother tongue. What are your thoughts on what I perceive as a contradiction?
Well, Yeah, I would say, yes, there is a contradiction, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be contradiction in everybody's case. There may be people, yes, I agree with you. I think I myself mentioned that I'm sorry, I do not know what has happened. Can I just log off and come back in 1 sec? Or is it okay? I'll speak because I don't want to waste time. I said that, the language, that is what I call as can you hear me, Mahima?
Yes, ma'am.
The esoteric language, the academic language. And yes, when even for example, when people from our own friend circles or people who come to our house from a rural background use language in a certain way, we try to tell them, well, why do you say that? In Kannada, for example, many people use the word aite to say it is there. But the Brahminical language is that ide. I always fight when people say, why are you telling, kids or others to say ide, because this is Brahminical classical language, which you think is the right language. Let them use it because it's the language of the people. So I agree with you that even today that thought is there in the minds, and that is what many are trying to propagate. But I think that there is also an alternate movement in language usage when we are saying the language of the people is the one that needs to be used. If I can just take quickly half a minute and say, in Karnataka itself, for example, there are different types of Kannada, different dialects. But usually the Kannada that is accepted and the Kannada that is used in books, in discourses, in different kinds of writings is a Kannada of the southern part of the state. But where is the language of North Karnataka, the Hyderabad Karnataka? It's not there. So definitely this is a point that we have to ponder. That is why I said in the language of comfort. And so I think that it's fine to say mother tongue, which often is in direct conflict with this language, which is thrust on many people from outside, which is classical and Brahminical. But then I think, as I said, the time has now come, and it has already come, I feel, to use language the way people use it. I hope I have answered your question or just shared my thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sweta Rupa? Yes,
yeah. Is there another question?
Yes, ma'am. There are a few more questions.
First, can I just leave and join in a minute?
I think we lost her.
I guess the window was minimized by ma'am, and she'll just join. Vibhuti ma'am, if you are speaking, can you please unmute?
Yes, Indra Ramarao is back.
Yeah, I'm back. Tell me the next question, Mahima.
Yes. Sweta Rupa Mishra says, when you talked about writing in your own language, it reminded me of how much is lost in translation.
Yeah.
What are your views on feminist literature losing cause through misinterpretation and gaps in translation?
Translation from English into the mother tongue or from the mother tongue into other languages? Which one are you referring to?
In writing in your language and translating it into English.
Well, that I know that that's a very relevant question because I'm involved in this work, and even translating from English to Kannada is not, or our own languages, mother tongue, is not an easy process. But I think, yes, I agree that it is a challenge, and a lot of it can be lost if you engage in what I call as literary translations, because I'm really shocked at the way some translations have come, and it just doesn't convey. So I agree that things can be lost. But I think that translation itself is an art into which you have to put a lot of effort, and many times it is contextual. It cannot be just, English word translated into Kannada, or Kannada word, or Tamil word, or Telugu word, or Marathi word translated into English. So I think that, I will just quickly share with you that the National Translation Mission is bringing out now translation equivalents in many subjects. Maybe it's bringing out one in sociology. So from English to Kannada, and we have about 12,000 words. And it has taken me 7 years because I'm the editor. And how many times I had to change, revisit, relook. And even with all that, I still have my doubts. And we have shared it with people and it's gone around, and they said, is this word okay? Is this translation okay? But I'm sure that attempt must be done because, you have to reach out to people. When your books have to go to a wider audience, I think that attempt must be there. But as I said, you have to read a lot, understand both the languages. Unfortunately, today it's getting rather difficult to find people who are conversant in 2 languages, but I won't give up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Prakriti Arya asks, we know that every other song or movie in Bollywood and also in other regional cinema uses sexist language.
Yeah.
Does enjoying these songs or movies make you less of a feminist or non-feminist? Can we look at them critically and yet listen and watch them?
No, I'll tell you. It doesn't make me less of a feminist. It's only because I'm a feminist and I think differently that I question them. Otherwise, we sit and, tolerate that. But it's very, it's the reactions to that. When I hear songs or dialogues, at least the least that you can do, as I said, when feminism becomes a way of life, you can at least comment on that. But definitely true that, media and social media, which the shock is at the language, the kind of sexist language that they are using today, and to insult women. What's going on in Karnataka today, you are all aware of this. And here, how gender has also come. Gender, it is an issue. And the gendered presentation in the media has made it, you are angry. So I think that, but when you take a larger, wider audience, many people don't even take that seriously. They just say, well, these are there. But the serious ones must react. And that's one way of challenging it.
Thank you, Professor. Kevna Desai asks, my question is about censorship of society and self both.
Censorship of society
and self?
Okay.
Both. Do you think that hinders women's expression or feminist expressions particularly? Secondly, do we need a different intersectional feminist lens in critical appreciation of women's creative expressions for breaking stereotypes of genres and literary framework?
I think the answer to the question is in the question itself. Yeah, you need that intersectional framework and that bent of mind, if you have to understand it. But as far as my own experience goes, even today, there are very few people, very few institutions that are reacting to these things, with that kind of frame of mind. Many times all this just goes away, but it's definitely true that, as you have rightly said, an intersectional frame of mind is necessary. There is no doubt or questions about that.
Thank you. And lastly, Saurya Mishra says, thank you for a wonderful lecture, ma'am. I wanted to know your thoughts on how English language is placed in the Dalit Bahujan thought. For the emancipation of the marginalized, how do we place the language of comfort here?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, it's definitely true that when I'm saying that we write in the mother tongue, that is only, one way in which I'm looking at it. I'm not saying that we should not expose ourselves to any other language. So in the Dalit Bahujan, what is the word you used in the Dalit Bahujan? Court, is it? What did you say?
Thought.
Sorry?
Dalit Bahujan thought.
Okay, thought. Okay, sorry. No, I think that nobody has the right to deny the knowledge of any language. And I am personally of the opinion that everybody should know English, because in a country where, in a society where language itself has become a divider. You know, in Karnataka itself, let me tell you, when, you know, the pro-Kannada movement reached its peak, and when the state wanted to introduce English in primary schools, and many of the people who were leaders of this movement started protesting, you know, the Dalit Bahujan movement itself asked them the question, where are your children? Why are you telling us that we should not learn English? Okay, you send all your children abroad or to private school. Most of them were abroad, because I know all these people. So they said, you have no right to tell the state or anybody or any of us not to learn English. So I think that language is power. Language is your Shakti. So when I said writing in mother tongue, I definitely did not mean to say that one should not know English, because English, definitely, yes, it should be there. And I think that now, you know, there is a realization that if you don't know that language, that there's one more level of discrimination you enter. And that's exactly what has been happening. So whether like in, when, you know, in classes, for example, today it's become mostly monolinguistic, but I know, monolingual, sorry. I know there are classes where students have demanded, it's okay, you know, tell us in English also. Let me write in Kannada or let me write in any language. But you, whatever you are explaining, you say you explain in English, because let us know the concepts, because we need to learn.
Thank you so much, Professor, for answering the questions and your insights on them. Would you like to conclude your lecture in a few minutes?
I think it's, yeah, I like Professor Linda Lane said, I would say thank you. And I hope, you know, I have been able to share some of my thoughts, and this is a real good opportunity for me. And that's all. I think this discourse and debate must go on. And I would definitely say that whether it is in English or in any language, mother tongue, we simply cannot get away by making mistakes, because there are, you know, including plagiarism, you know, many times they say, okay, I'm writing in my language, so it's all right. I think it is not all right. You have to maintain quality, you have to maintain originality. So as long as we don't put the same conditions for measuring quality in whatever the language may be, this gaps will continue. So while I'm a strong, you know, advocate and do a lot of my writing in my language, I'm also very clear and firm that people should know English, and whatever I may write in any language, that there should be certain standard protocols that we have to follow. That is what I call self-censorship, which we must do. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Ramarao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I would now like to welcome Professor Pushpesh Kumar for a lecture on intersectional marginality and feminist responses in the post-colonial countries. Thank you.
Please unmute, sir.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, IMPRI and Professor Vibhuti Patel and all of you. But I'm really sorry, and I place my apology in the beginning that I could not go through the mail very carefully, and this post-coloniality and all that. There was a mess at home because of illnesses, and I could not concentrate on the word post-coloniality. But anyway, so I'll be basically will be touching upon the very conceptual aspect of intersectionality And wherever it is required, because I have done my research on queer and trans studies, and wherever it is required, I will be bringing insights from there to sort of flesh it out what intersectionality would mean in my understanding. So I'll be repeating most of the points which Dr. Lane has sort of told to reiterate her points, in fact, and then trying to come back to the context of South Asian Indian context, maybe often not, and then with the help of queer movement, I try to shed some light on intersectionality. So at the outset, I want to say that intersectionality is not concerned with diversity or multiculturalism. It's not mere difference, diversity, or multiculturalism, but with power relationship, specifically the ways in which differences embeds domination and oppression. So these differences are full of domination and oppression. They embed domination and oppression. Of course, class is an important marker of inequality. However, one-dimensional conceptualization of individuals or groups did not capture the complexity of people's lived experience. So if you only confine to class inequality, and that has been there in feminist movements, 1970s, says socialist feminists, talking about, uh, in collaboration with the left movements and working class movements, mobilizations, left mobilizations, the women were talking about gender and class together, right? So this may be two-dimensional, but the realities are in fact much more complex and go beyond even the gender and class together. So, race in the Western context, for example, you see that race is an axis of inequality and domination. But conceptualization of color needed that did not erase the experiences of women of color, immigrant women of color, gay and lesbians of color. So, social hierarchies are not one-dimensional. Race, gender, class, sexuality, caste become central to the understanding of intersectionality. And as Dr. Lane has said, that it emanates from Black women's activism in the US, United States. And I come to a very important organization, which was called Combahee River Collective, which was Combahee River Collective was a Black feminist lesbian socialist organization, which was active in Boston from 1974 to 1980, in fact. So this collective is significant for including sexual orientation in Black feminism. So Black feminism about, sort of highlighting the exclusions of and discriminatory practices of the white feminism, right? But the Black feminism was also talking about a cis body, a cis woman, So way back in 1970s, you will see that how this Combahee River Collective, which was a group of socialist, lesbian, Black feminists, and they brought in the question, inserted the question of sexual orientation within Black feminism. And their activism as feminist and lesbian did not advocate for separatism. If you look at white lesbianism, right, the white lesbianism has a separatist tendency. They're rejecting heteronormative families, community, marriage, all kinds of relations with men, rejecting men, etc. But here, the Black lesbian socialist women who are proposing, trying to insert sexual orientation, the question of sexual orientation within Black feminism, were not separatist, because they also need to come back to community. And the racial experiences of the Blacks were a common issue. So they can't, their life is also embedded into that racial experience. So they were not separatists like white lesbians who have no experience of racism. And also the question of class was important. So in 1977, they issued a Combahee River statement, Black feminist organizing in 1970s and 1980s. And the most general statement, they said, of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. And as our particular task, the development of integrative analysis and practices based upon the fact that major system of operations are interlocking. So they were talking about this interlocking system of hierarchy and interlocking system of oppressions. The synthesis of class operations create conditions of our lives. As Black women, we see Black feminism as a logical political movement to combat the manifold and simultaneous oppression that all women of color face. So they were talking about multiple kind of oppression and a simultaneity of this oppression. These multiple forms of oppressions are also simultaneous. I cannot say that I'm a woman, I'm a Black, I experience racial discrimination and racial oppression, and not the sexist oppression or sexual oppression from our own men, as well as from the white men, right? So there could be multiple oppression, and the experiences of which can be very, very simultaneous. What we find is intersectionality approach is a combination of so this is scholarly theory, and I don't always see that there is a disconnect between the theory and the experiences. The theory also emerges out of experiences and feed into explaining or describing those experiences. So intersectionality may be a combination of both scholarly theory and social justice practices, right? So it has come from the social justice movement, but it also emerged as a theoretical vantage point, and it's always in the constant move, in the process of being revised, relooked at, and adding new and new dimension to intersectionality. In 1981 comes a Black feminist anthology. This breeze called My Back, by two authors, and by two Black feminist authors. One of them is, I just forgot their names. And in one of the essays, it was highlighted that feminism is a political theory and practice to free all women, women of color, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbian, old women, as well as white, economically privileged women, privileged heterosexual women. So all women have to listen to each other, the multiple voices and the multiple stories, but also what you privilege within a movement, whose voice is privileged, right? It's not the white, heterosexual, privileged women's voice, which will be privileged within intersectional approach, right? It may be the Black, poor, working class, aged, and lesbian, and disabled, who has all these multiple experience. Maybe the priorities of the movement will be decided from that voice. And again, this movement will be self-reflective to add new categories. So another example of critique from white feminists appeared in Angela Davis' book, Women, Race and Class. And she recounted the history of Black and white women's fight for social equality. Davis challenged the strongly held belief that women only recently started to work outside home and were denied employment opportunity on the basis of femininity. And this was the voice of dominant voice within feminism of the white women. And they said Black women are always already in the public domain. They have been working, right? Not in the privileged positions, but always outside. They have not been confined to home, right? So, for example, within queer movement across the globe or in India, if you see that people are talking about coming out, coming out, coming out. But if you look at many of the trans feminine, trans masculine person, they're always already out. So coming out is not a problem for them. No, so the kind of location, the kind of embodiment, the kind of ideas, right? The kind of experiences they are some of them are very hyper visible bodies. And hyper visibility as an axis of inequality creates its own problem. So some people want to become visible as gay or lesbian. They're talking about queer visibility. But what about those queer who are always already visible? Right? The transness is written on the body, right? And that is not a problem. So how do you grapple when you homogenize the whole queer group and you do not bring in intersectionality? You don't see the fine line of these differences and how these differences are embedded in power, oppression, discrimination, stigma, and many other things, right? So uh, So as a slave black woman labored side by side with a black man and were submitted to the same punishment of flogging and mutilations. So black women were also subjected to flogging and mutilations as the black men. Whereas white women were treated as very soft, delicate, mother, etc., etc. So their experiences of oppression, which was very, very racial, very, very racial. And they were also masculinized women, right? And black men were hyper masculinized, masculine person in certain context. And as Professor Lane is talking about context, in other, they are subdued. In other contexts, they may be subdued. For example, Dalit men may be very, very hyper masculine. If you look at the Dalit feminist autobiographies, right, of Urmila Pawar, for example, even within the Dalit movement, they were asked to sit on the floor, or and the Dalit men would sit on the chair. So the kind of hierarchy and oppression. So they are very hyper masculine men, though they are Dalit activists, right? But in the context of, if you look into Maharashtra, the Maratha, dominant Maratha caste and the Dalit man, how they will interact, that interactional moment, there this man will be very, very subdued, right? Maybe, yeah. So we also have to look at the context, So rather than protecting as mother, so whereas white women were protected as mother, right, as they did to white women, slave women classified black or slave owners classified black women as breeders and sold their children as livestock. If you go back to the history of slavery. So how one segment, one category of women are delicate, mother, that itself is a burden, for womanhood. But it's a different kind of a burden. So somebody has written that whereas white women were struggling to get out of the kitchen, the black women were struggling to get inside the kitchen, right? Because they were so burdened with the work, overwork, right? So they wanted the same kind of luxury which many times white women had. Whereas white women found this space very suffocative, right? So if you look at the privileged upper caste women's autobiographies, you'll find they have written their diaries in the kitchen. But the Dalit women would want that luxury to be in the kitchen and somebody is assisting them and working, doing work for them, right? So this may be the caste, class, age, and many kinds of differences which are embedded with power, oppression, etc. So unlike black men, they were victims of sexual abuse and other barbarous mistreatment that would only be inflicted on women. So as women also, they were oppressed, right? So women who were listed unfit for motherhood under compulsory, they were pushed into, if you look at the policies, how policies are discriminatory, So how white women were treated, how black women were treated. And if you come out as lesbian, black lesbian, how you would be treated. And if you are a Black woman, lesbian, and also disabled and aged, what will be your condition, right? In different contexts, how multiple ways of power oppression will operate on your body. So women are listed unfit. So these Black women were listed unfit under the slavery system for a long, long time in the US. You see that they were listed unfit for motherhood. They were like breeders, right? They keep on producing food. They're not delicate mother like white women. And they were pushed into compulsory sterilization law, included women of color and immigrant women. So the only contraception was made available to the Black women were the sterilization. They should be sterilized because they're producing a lot of babies. They're breeders. Sometimes the children were sold off, right? But these women have, the white women have access to different kind of white privileged women, of course, of certain classes has access later on, the access to many contraceptive measures, and that gave them freedom and liberation. And they were celebratory, which the sociologist Anthony Giddens is talking about plastic sexuality. So some women can enjoy this moment of plastic sexuality in 1990s or maybe before that, whereas other women were pushed into sterilization. And we have a story of Devo Provera. Professor Vibhuti Patel would know better the stories of Devo Provera. Provera was brought from Canada under family planning program, which was banned in Canada, in fact. And it was sort of distributed into juggies and jhopris, slum areas. And so, like the Black women were subjected to sterilization, these women were subjected to a contraception which was banned. And then many of these working class Dalit women have experiences of their menstrual cycle were tampered with, and many things happened to their bodies and all. So how different classes of women are treated by the state, and a state is an institution, right, in which you have certain kind of understanding of certain classes of women, and that impacts upon the life of this woman. So again, which Professor Lane has talked about, Patricia Hill Collins. So she did not like the additive approach. You keep on adding this category of women, that category of sexuality, this category of sexuality, and additive approach, add on. So this is not simply adding upon, but locate them in the overarching structure of domination. So you have to visualize the multiple layers of domination which people experience at three levels he's talking about. The personal level, your personal experience, group or community, and in social institution. So the personal level accounts for our unique biography, which includes emotions and values and influences that shaped by personal experiences. For example, even if you are very, very privileged, class, caste, masculine, gender, but you have sexual non-conformity. What is your biography within that context of privilege, even then? So personal biography is very, very important to sort of understand intersectionality. The group and community level captures the cultural context of shared experiences and collective memory. For example, these Black women who are pushed towards this sterilization, or the Dalit women and working class women subjected to Devo Provera, and in the queer context I'm talking about, there is a trans scholar, Aizura, and who talks about queer as, subjects and queer as population. And I have also written about it. What kind of queers are treated as subjects? The consumer subjects who has a lot of money, affluence, they can engage in with middle class consumption, all the broadly mobile middle class consumption, right? They are initiated into consumer citizens, and they are beneficiaries of law. Corporate would offer them some kind of privilege. Maybe, I'm not saying yes, but maybe yes. But whereas certain classes of queer are treated as population, and that appeared, surfaced during the time of COVID, the first lockdown, whereas trans populations majority of them, the sex work was stopped for trans feminine people. The trans masculine poor people did not have access to hormones therapy. There was gender dysphoria and all that. And they were asking, the trans feminine people in Hyderabad, for example, were going for public litigations in the court just to get minimum subsistence things, you know. And in Karnataka, they were asking for 2,000 rupees per month as pension or as compensation, 2,000 rupees. Whereas in the same COVID context, you will find that very, very privileged queer, you know, they were asking for right to marry, and it's going on. So on the one hand, they're asking for substantive rights, existential battle they're engaged in, whereas the privileged were asking right to marry, inheritance, right to adoption. So how the priorities are different, even it surfaced within the COVID context. Many of the trans feminine people have committed suicide, whereas the privileged queer also had some problem because they were sent back to home, etc. But still their negotiability was much, much better. Then and if you look at these gurus and chela system within the trans groups, which they have, the gurus were relying on chelas. They have a lot of sense of power, prestige, etc. That all was crumbling in that context, and trans people, you know, have become hostile to each other, and there were a lot of cases of murder, trans murders in different cities were witnessed. So why? And if you look at when the Section 377 was read down in 2018, you look at the modes of celebration of queer people and how there were different ways they were celebrating and reacting to it. Whereas the privileged gay were celebrating in pubs, clubs, and you know, there was rainbow cake which were being cut in Bangalore and many other places. There were trans masculine and trans feminine people were reacting, and they were talking about privacy. 377 talks about sex in private, and for trans people there is so much of publicness of sex, because many of them are sex workers and they solicit their customer in the public places. So there the privileged queer were celebrating the privacy of sex, right? Whereas the trans people were talking about, and one of the trans leader, he wrote a poem. He wrote a poem, trans masculine person. He wrote a poem, said, "Dance, dance, dance, Khairati, in your sari on the roads of Allahabad. Dance as you dance," something like that. So he was trying to foreground the memory of Khairati, and Khairati was a trans person who was, that was the first case of penalizing under Section 377 during colonial rule of a cross-dresser person in the streets of Allahabad. He was just picked up because of just a cross-dressing. Khairati was not even engaging in sex, and the whole body, if you read Foucauldian perspective, the whole body was examined by the colonial doctors, and they saw the anus, the shape of the anus, and what was the shape of? On that ground, they speculated that this person might be a habitual sodomite, right? And this person was penalized. You know, so how a subject is transformed into a population which can be dealt with by the medical regime, medical legal power, medical legal regime, and how that person is subjected. So even within queer, you should see the intersectionality, the experiences, the location, the context, and how they operate. But there can be shared experiences, so that's what Patricia Hill Collins is talking about, personal biography. Then she's talking about group and community level. And then third is social institutions, such as law, education, church, media. They are at the level of the system. So personal experiences, group and shared, and also the institution, and how a combination of all these operate if you want to understand intersectionality. Collins argued that excluded groups confront different dimensions of the matrix in various social, political, and economic contexts. And Professor Lane is also talking about context. Professor Indra has also talked about context. So depending on the context, individuals may sometimes encounter privilege and other times face subordination, right? Thus, a person is both a member of multiple dominant groups and a member of multiple subordinate groups. And we have to see these nuances. So Collins identified the dimension of connected relationship among system of operation. So she talked about intersectionality and matrix of domination, right? So intersectionality refers to particular form of intersecting operation. For example, intersection of race, gender, sexuality, nation, even nation, So intersectional paradigm reminds us that operation cannot be reduced to one fundamental type and that operation work together in producing injustice, right? And what is the matrix of domination? The matrix of domination refers to how these intersecting operations are organized, how social institutions established and maintain practices that discriminate. Social institution can also change their practices and the form of regulation that. So using the intersectional paradigms not only explains operation, but also provides us understanding to recognize social relation of domination and develop resistance, right? Because your experiences are there. And if you come as collective, you're also developing framework of resistance. And using Foucault, that wherever there is power, there is also resistance. There are ways of how do you understand this resistance. In the case of Latina undocumented immigrant, for example, Patricia Hill Collins is giving example that the people from Latin America, Latinas, they are also undocumented many a times. They enter into North America, but they're not documented. So if you are documented, then you enter into citizenship, even on the margins. But if you're undocumented, you are a non-citizen. And when you're non-citizens, you are exploited in multiple ways. So your labor will be purchased at a very cheap rate, and you will be segregated in particular occupations within the economy. For example, for Latina, it is cleaning houses and caretaking at a very, very cheap rate, right? So intersectionality and matrix of power cannot be fully grasped. But I'm saying that intersectionality, and somebody brought in the question of Mary Joan, right? And in some way, I try to sort of answer this question that if you want to understand intersectionality and matrix of power, that cannot be fully grasped without a historical approach. So you have to bring in the historic, how this situation has emerged, how people are trapped into a particular circumstances. And for that, 2-3 things are very important: the conquest, colonization, and slavery. These 3 things, how some communities are conquered, colonized, right? And power is exercised on them, right? Where So while all whites may be privileged in certain sense, whiteness intersect with class, sexuality, age. These are the things which she's talking about. Uh, And the question of standpoint was also coming, as I could see. So Collins highlighted the researcher's position or standpoint in society in the production of knowledge, which he referred to as standpoint epistemology, right? So Collins represented a standpoint that incorporates all these interlocking status positions such as race, class, gender, nationality, and sexuality. This matrix of domination includes not only sites of operation, but also ones that can serve as sites of resistance, as I said. And the sites of the theories emerge, standpoint emerge from that sites of resistance. So how do people resist? If they understand what operation is and how they articulate. The articulation itself is a resistance, and that can map out on multiple trajectories. And we need to understand it within a specific context. So Collins' matrix includes 3 levels, which we have already discussed: the personal level, the biography, group or community level, or cultural context created by race, class, and gender, and the systemic level of social institution and what is the connectedness of within those institutions. For example, in bureaucracy, what is the representation of Dalit? What is the representation of Dalit? In media, in the newsroom, for example, if you look at the mainstream media, in the newsroom where it is decided how the news will be represented, how many Dalit people are there. And there was a survey which said that there is hardly any Dalit man in the newsroom. It is all dominated by upper caste male, right? And they decide how the news will be broadcasted, what will be the content of news, how Dalit issues will be shown or not shown or whatever. And then there is a corporate which controls the media, right? So institutional embeddedness and connection within the institution and how it impacts upon life and how all that has developed historically. So colonization, conquest, post-colonial, elite, power, politics, everything. If you connect to that, you will have a holistic grasp of intersectionality. Otherwise, we may miss out on that. So, right. So I think I will sort of, if there are questions coming, and the other thing which I've written about, and Professor Patel would know because I was speaking on that, on the Dalit women's question, and all of you know that how in late 80s and 90s that Dalit feminism is emerging in India and questioning the Brahmanization of the feminist movement, the mainstream feminist movement. And also they're talking about Savarnization of feminist movement or Brahmanization of feminist movement and masculinization of Dalit movement. So they're questioning Dalit men, right? How they behave vis-a-vis Dalit women. And if you look at even the Dalit family, the sexual division of labor, despite women coming out, the burden is on women as breadwinners many a times, not as male, like in upper caste. Men have to be the breadwinner, right? That is the ideology, despite a lot of women working outside. But within certain caste, the burden, the onus is on women to run the family affairs, run the household, right? So these are the things you will find very interesting. So the Dalit women's movement and Dalit women's literature is coming out, talking about intersectionality of caste, class, oppression, linking it to broader structures of power, capitalism, globalization, and many other issues they have talked about through their autobiographical narratives, reflections on the village, what is city, what is the connect, what is liberatory, what is not. And again, if you read Dalit autobiography or even Sarmila Rege's writings, but there is a queer context I bring in, and I've written about it. So there was a conference in Bangalore called Transform, organized by CLPR, Center for Law and Policy Research, and this time I participated as a speaker, but last time I was audience and I was just listening to it. There, this Dalit feminist of National Federation of Dalit Women, the president of it, Ruth Manorma. So Ruth Manorma was there, and there was a Dalit trans woman, Grace Banu from Tamil Nadu, who was there. And Grace Banu is asking question, though both of them are holding on to Ambedkar. So even within trans movement, if you look at one category of trans people are become Sanatani and Hinduized, and they're part of Hijra Khara, Mahamandaleshwar, talking about it. But other, the caste question within transness and the low caste, the Dalit trans women and trans men, trans community, they are bringing foregrounding Ambedkar within the pride marches. So why some become Sanatani, some are holding on to Ambedkar and foregrounding Ambedkar. And even while foregrounding Ambedkar, a Dalit trans woman is questioning a precedent of National Federation of the Ruth Manorma. She's saying she is blamed of heterosexism. She doesn't care about, she talks about, Kalpa Kannabhiran's article, if you read, broadening kinship, so oppression. So how people force kinship within movements based on oppression, right? All oppressed come together, and that is your kinship, right? Kinship based on your political positions, your shared experiences of oppression or different oppression, yet there is a common thread to it, and you come together. So broadening kinships is talking about where Dalit women are internationally trying to forge association with human rights organization, Black women's organization, and many others. So they're broadening the horizon of kinship based on oppression. But at the same time, they left out to listen to trans feminine Dalit women. And trans feminine Dalit women are victims of caste, class, gender, sexuality, and hypervisibility of their bodies, and many things, the material disadvantage, and heterosexism. So she was pointing that Dalit feminists should incorporate heterosexism within their movement to open up and accommodate the voices of Dalit trans women or Dalit trans groups, etc. So, and later on, many are disability, the voices of disabilities are coming within trans men who are invisibilized categories within, and they're Dalit trans men, right, who are voicing their concerns, and many other entities within, like somebody said, asexuality. Asexuality is now coming up as a group which is completely invisibilized. So for them, visibility is a big problem at the moment within queer groups and movements. Whereas for trans women, it is hypervisibility that creates. So how, and they're trapped within that. So there are commonalities, there are differences, but these differences are embedded with power, hierarchy, oppression, and there are multiple ways and in multiple contexts, people are trapped, but we also have to locate them into broader structural power of capitalism, of colonization, of globalization, of governance, of different relations between different institutions and how they operate in a given historical and contemporaneous context. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, for the very important and in-depth address. I would now like to call on to any questions from the audience that they may have. Professor Patel, would you like to reflect on Professor Kumar's lecture? Professor, you are on mute.
Yeah. Professor Pushpesh Kumar gave very important examples, and I think women's movement has also taken it up, that you have a dual approach to white bodies and the non-white bodies, and that has been a very important struggle over last 40 years. And I think what he gave an example of Depo-Provera and whole population control policy, which is so racist and classist, and women's movement world over especially in Asian countries, we have had a major fights, and in last 40 years, right from the population control, excesses during the emergency, 18 months of emergency period, where poor men were forcibly sterilized. And after that, the 5-year plan onwards, what we have seen is increasingly harmful hormone-based contraceptives dumped by multinational pharmaceutical companies in the West to Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So I think that was a very important thing which he talked about, how and also sick women and sickly women. So there's a sick. So we colored women are sick women, and they need to be controlled, and they need to be, their rights have to be violated. They should not be given any agency. While the sickly women, as he said, that white women is a very dainty, and they have to be looked after, and they are like flowers, and women of color. And I think that's the foundation on which currently also the global division of labor that has taken place, no, where all the hazardous and dirty and stigmatized work is assigned to women of color, while there is a housewifeization of women, white women in the first world or industrialized world. And yes, yesterday Manisha also said there is a south in north and there is a north in south. So same thing gets permeated even in the post-colonial societies. Yeah. Very, very erudite and extremely complex issues Professor Pushpesh Kumar took, and he was so lucid, no, with the concrete grounded reality that he described while theorizing the issue of sexuality, hypersexuality. And the very important thing, asexual are invisibilized while trans bodies are hypersexualized.
Thank you, Professor Patel, for your insights on the lecture. Professor Kumar, would you like to reply to Professor Patel and conclude your lecture in a few minutes? Thank you.
No, I think I must thank Professor Patel and everyone here, Professor Linda Lane and Professor Indira Ramarao and Dr. Arjun and the whole team of IMPRI and all the audience and participants in the course. Yeah, I can just say thank you.
Yeah, but you can also ask Professor Indira Ramarao and Dr. Linda Lane also to respond to Professor Pushpesh Kumar's this, because it is a very, very different kind of reality. The lived experiences of sexual minorities. It's also a lot of learning for us. No?
Thank you. Yes.
Simi wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pushpesh Kumar, and thank you, Professor Indira Ramarao and Dr. Linda Lane. I have a question for Professor Pushpesh Kumar, as in, when you are unpacking so many complex issues, I would want to know your views on the way forward in terms of how we as a society are going forward in the future, and can there be any possible policy implications? What are your policy recommendations so as to ensure greater acceptability and accommodativeness among the people, so as to not malign any particular human based upon their sexualities and their orientation?
I would also like to add and ask question to Professor Pushpesh Kumar that, except for law about 2019 Transgender Persons Act, which is also extremely flawed, and decriminalization of 377, what has the state done for so far as the development investment in transgender? Everything is identity, so much so that if you see this year's union budget, every section of society has done the audit. Elderly, people with disability, minorities, SC, ST, women, trade unions, informal sector workers, all of them for past 1 month, 15 days, they have been continuous. When it comes to transgender population or the sexual minorities, there is nothing, no material issues or lived experiences. What about the education? What about the employment? What about the skill development? What about the housing rights when they are abandoned? Nothing. And even after 2 years of extremely bitter experience, why there is no discourse on the human development investment?
I think, I agree with what you're saying, that they are completely neglected by the state. And vaguely, a year back, I heard that the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, have allocated some funds for the trans people, but what has happened to that funding, and what kind of, the only thing we are hearing is some progress has been made in terms of making their identity card, which has been made convenient through portals and all that. Because of the success of the movement, I don't credit it credit the state for it or the government for it, but it is the success of the movement, in partial success of the movement in achieving that. The second thing is that it is now left to the states. For example, the first phase of COVID-19, the government was blamed, the central government. So now the central government is shifting it to the states. The states would take care. The other thing has happened is Garima Grih, Garima Grih. The name itself is so Sanskritized, which is a sheltered home for trans people, And one of the criteria for the inmates of the Garima Grih is that you should not be doing sex work. Now tell me, what is the alternative offered for people if they don't do sex work? But the state is also patronizing certain trans people by incorporating them into the power relation, transgender councils or something, and they sort of advocate the government's point of view. So there is a contradiction, there is a conflict which is also emerging within the trans. And one segment of trans, which is of course upper caste, and Dalits are also being patronized within that organization, Dalit trans people. And they have become Sanatani, Mahamand, and lot of funds is coming, lot of money, lot of funding, lot of corporate funding and other things are invested in that. So what kind of things are nurtured, what is left out, but the real substantive concerns of the trans people are not taken. Whereas LGBT is not the concern of state, they are also happy with the civil rights, and the government is also happy with extending the civil rights. And this is how you understand the neoliberal states. So neoliberal states will keep extending civil rights to you, but will not make resources available to do distributive justice or welfare justice or whatever. So, and people are celebratory, the hegemonic gay, lesbian constituency are happy with civil rights. They also want to adopt and put their children in very fancy public schools, like the middle class. If you look at the European example, and Lisa Dugan is talking homonormativity. So like heteronormative, many of the privileged were becoming homonormative. They want to settle down, monogamy, etc., etc. Whereas the very working class gay people have no voice at all, right? And whereas trans people, because they are politically mobilized, come together, etc., they have been able to achieve some or the other success. But that is not the concern of this, very, very neglected. And I think the trans movement should ask a lot of questions to the power that to the government.
So I think the more study circles are required about things like gender audit of budget or the investment, right to education, right to food, right to housing, right to health.
That's what I was wondering also, because it is left to the states now,
Correct.
The state, and different Kerala has its own transgender policy. Odisha has, and that is also a tokenistic.
Tamil Nadu also. Tamil Nadu also has.
They're just flagging it off. We are doing this for trans or that for trans. Some trans people are also celebrating that, yes, something is coming, because there was nothing, so something is coming. So again, the movement is slowing down in certain ways. COVID conditions and COVID struggle becomes priority for the trans constituencies. So all these complexities, add to it.
Yeah. Thank you for this discussion. Dr. Linda, would you like to add something to the discussion?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, first of all, thank Dr. Kumar for that brilliant lecture, for kind of bringing us full circle, because where I may started off being very broad and maybe very indistinct in what I wanted to achieve with my lecture, yours really brought home the meaning of feminism and intersectionality. Thank you so much for the enlightenment here. I would also like to thank Professor Ramarao for giving voice to this in a good way, in the sense that where perhaps Dr. Kumar and myself, we were very intense about the way we think we should, the way intersectionality and feminisms have been expressed, how they've been lived on the bodies of everyday people. I like to thank Professor Ramaroy for telling us that there is a way to articulate this, by giving voice, by using our voices in the way, in our language of comfort, to say something about the things that are very interesting for us and are affecting our lives today. So thank you both, or all of you, for giving me the opportunity to just be in such illustrious company today. Thank you.
I think Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath is with us. I think we request you, how do you feel about the sessions that are going on currently? Because she's a veteran feminist and extremely, made a very pioneering contribution. Yeah.
Thank you, Vibhuti. It's been an absolutely spellbinding panel. I mean, just, very, very sort of began yesterday. I have seldom come across such a rich array of expertise and experts and candor. And I think starting with Linda's and Indra's interventions and rounding up with Professor Kumar was a brilliant, brilliant idea. I had just a couple of thoughts, and I wonder if I could take this opportunity to just share. You very rightly raised the question of the future. What do we do with this shared knowledge? What do we do with being informed and actually walking into the spaces that were hitherto denied to us? The question is, how do we expand our universe of empathy, of intervention? And I'm not using the word empowerment because it is used, it's bandied around in a very... So the language of how does it enter into the space of the matrix of domination? How, for example, does the ethics of care come in? How are solidarities built? Because he spoke very eloquently about sites of resistance, simultaneous to the sites of domination. And I think that is the envelope perhaps we could push a little, to look at it as not as a closing universe, but an expanding universe of possibilities still left to be explored and engaged with. And especially the ethics of care in the post-COVID context. What does it do in terms, because I think the trans population has the opportunity to create a new lexicon of belonging at this point of time, be it Dalit, be it the various intersectionalities that I spoke about. The other question was that how has communal politics entered this space, which was hitherto not contaminated, if I may say so, by this particular language? Does it prove to be divisive because it's so overpowering, it's so patently there for all of us, and we are sort of cringing from the aftermath of what's happening in Karnataka and so on? How does trans politics help you to get over those, because the religion is also another site of intersectionality. So how does that work? I'd be very curious to know. Is there some way, is there a language that can somehow give us an alternative lexicon to fence this off? Thank you, but truly grateful to you, Vibhuti and Professor Kumar. I'm talking to Professor Kumar for giving us this feast. It's a veritable feast. And I think it should be an ongoing initiative. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Your words are really very encouraging and inspiring because this was the demand of the younger generation of IMPRI team. And I think we ventured into it and now feel really empowered. I would say, very confident that such a dense and complex theoretical issues we can discuss in a grounded way, linking them to the actual reality.
Thank you. Certainly. Thank you. Professor Indra Ramarao, would you also like to contribute to the discourse?
Please unmute yourself, Professor Indra Ramarao. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much, and it was a great learning experience for me to be part of this. And so every day, yesterday and today, there's so much learning that has taken place. Thank you. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Thank
Professor
you. Thank you,
Kumar.
everyone. No, I don't have to speak anything. I must be thankful to everyone present here and my co-panelists, Dr. Linda Lane and Professor Ramarao, and also Professor Meenakshi Gopinath for her reflections and closing comments, and everyone, Professor Vibhuti Patel, of course, and everyone from the IMPRI team and the participants who are invisible but very significant entities. Yeah.
Professor Kumar, if you would allow, there are a few questions from the audience.
Six questions. There are 6 questions.
My God, I'm not so competent to handle all these questions. But anyway, I'll attempt.
Thank you, Professor. Makina Merchant asks, don't you think that only once the law changes will the mindsets of the people change?
Yeah, I think there is always a hiatus between the legal change and the social change, right? The pace of these two do not match. But definitely legal change also make a lot of sense. And then again, I have a faith in people's movement. It is a mobilization, it is a movement, it is the voices of the oppressed through which the movements spring up, that becomes important, to keep pace with the legal change and even to further transform that legal provision which has come up and find faults with the existing laws also and move and push it to a different trajectory of further liberation. And this is a constant process which should go on and which is going on despite a lot of oppression, domination, power politics at global, local, and many other levels, right?
Thank you. Tanuja Sachdev says, what are the policies in other countries or the state policies solely for trans people?
I'm not so well versed with this, but definitely there are differences in different countries, different nation states. Some of the nation states are more accepting to it, and some of the other. But if you look at the whole global politics, we all live in the neoliberal context. And if you see, even if they have offered rights to people, the civil rights to people, they are not backed by enough resources, even economic resources. Professor Patel was concerned, where are the trans people in the budget? So they will not be there. So I remember my professor Dipankar Gupta, and he was talking about, the caste reservation. So give this caste or that caste, and many castes are aspiring for it. So he was saying that the size of national cake is shrinking, but the people who would eat it, the size of the people is increasing, So they will bring into fold of the civil rights many constituencies. You as immigrant take rights, you as trans take rights, or do this or do that. So in various degrees, all the nation states are trapped into this neoliberal game or gimmick, and the trans constituencies feel the pulls and pressures of it. Within that, again, intersectionality, if you look at the Black trans woman, and the white trans woman, the celebrity trans woman and the non-celebrity trans woman, there will be a lot of differences. And there are articles, I forgot the name of this, so I'm very bad with the names of the author. There is a one article on walking as a Black trans woman. And even walking as a Black trans woman is a crime, is a problem. There are a lot, despite progressive policies in the US, a lot of trans people are killed every year. And within the killed trans women, you will find, or transgender people, you will find that the most of them are coming from Black communities. The Black drag queens, look at their bodies, how it is ostracized and more stigmatized and subjected to a lot of brutalities. They're completely brutalized and all that. But they cannot escape the community. They are also pushed into the community because of the racial disadvantages, class disadvantages. So as a white a little affluent trans woman can have an independent existence. But the Black trans women are pushed to, even in India, the trans women or trans constituencies, which are more privileged in terms of class, caste, etc., they have independent existence, despite there are common, experiences. But the Dalit working class people are pushed into community life, right? Alternative community maybe, or pushed into their own. I have been working on Kothis who are trans feminine. They are both men and women. You can say they perform masculinity. They also perform, femininity, right? So they are forced to live with their heteronormative families, right? And how they negotiate life is very, very, and most of them are Dalits, right? Majority of them are Dalits. So how life, is, and then trans policies, I think trans life is precarious on the whole, but certain categories of trans are more precarious than the others. Aged trans people, for example, right? The states have no policy and have not included trans population within the aging pensions, right? And that is so different. But there are certain international things are in place, like WAP, World Professional something related to transgender health, and which is available online. So it provides a guideline for trans specific health. And in India also, certain NGOs are working along those lines and putting a pressure on the government that you should have trans policy, health policy on similar lines. And trans people in India are also asking that you should ensure VAT provisions within the health policies, right? So I am not very well versed with what is there in Canada or what is there in US or in Africa but there are differences, but there is also a common experience that these constituencies are very, very.
Thank you, Professor. And lastly, Dr. Sonia Dabas would like you to comment on the condition of disabled women.
Disability is not something which I have been much exploring, but definitely disabled women will have common experiences, but they will also have differences in their experiences if they are located in certain class, caste, age, and many other things, So if you are very privileged and you're disabled, you can access many of the things. You can purchase many of the facilities. You can even go abroad and buy things for yourself, etc. Life is difficult, but the negotiability of that difficulties might differ across caste, class, and different permutations and combinations of all these, right? So if you are aged and even if you are privileged, life is more difficult. But if you are young and disabled and privileged, then you may have some better negotiability. And that's why intersectionality becomes sort of important. And I'm not into disability studies, which I will now be interested in. So I'm not the right person to answer this question.
Linda has worked. Dr. Linda has worked on gender disability. And class.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. The problem with looking at disability is we tend again to kind of separate people out. We make it one category and think that by putting disabled in one category, we've kind of included everything. But I think, even if we don't know very much, and, that hasn't been your focus of research, I think you made a good point there, that it is the intersectionality context that is going to be important for the way or the livelihood prospects for that person or that group of persons. So, depending on where you are in your age, your caste, your color, religion, all of these will play an important thing. But I think most importantly, one thing we can say, wherever you are, if you're disabled in combination with other categories of disadvantage, you are on the lower spectrum of livelihood possibilities for the first, and your possibilities in society are very, very, very limited. So I'll just leave it there because I don't know more specifics, but this is kind of a general way of, approaching disability studies at the moment. Yeah.
And also role-lessness that feminists have been talking about. That generally, whatever stereotypical way in which you have some role, no? So what they said, we are treated not as a human being, we are treated as piece of furniture, and there is no role. So that is, I think, which creates a tremendous alienation among women with disability.
Thank you for this discussion, and thank you, Professor Kumar, for the in-depth answers. Now, as we come to the end of this very enriching and insightful day 2 of the 3-day immersive online certificate training program on feminism and the global social transformation, I, Mahima Kapoor, researcher at IMPRI, would like to formally conclude the event. On behalf of the IMPRI Gendered Impact Studies Center, I thank our distinguished experts, Dr. Linda Lane, Professor Indra Ramarao, and Professor Pushpesh Kumar for taking out the time and sharing their valuable insights on the theme intersectional feminism, social justice, and transformative change at personal and societal levels. We are grateful to all our participants who joined us here on Zoom, and we look forward to your vigilant participation on the day 3 of the program on interconnectedness of gender and other structures and systems in society within a global framework, where we would welcome Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, Professor Roxana Elizabeth Marinesk, and Dr. Chitra Sinha as the resource people. Thank you once again, and I wish you a very good night.
Thank you. I think all of us have done excellent time management, or yesterday also and today. So I think that's what. Because all of us are tuned to speaking minimum for 2 hours. We all are the PG teachers. So our lectures continue for 2 hours. And I think excellent self-discipline all the resource persons have shown. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.